Well, good morning. This is Peter Frank, and I'm here for another Concordia Technology Solutions video. We always have a lot of interesting and diverse topics here, especially as we talk with Bill Johnson. So, Bill, I'm hearing myself on your end. I'm not sure. Let's see. Hang on one second while we figure out the audio.
Okay, I don't actually know because the only place you're in my office is in my ear. So
Actually, I think it is me on my computer. Well, that's my fault. All right.
cool.
It's been that kind of morning. So let's get Bill on the screen here. Sorry about that.
No
Technology is fantastic when it works right, and it always does. It seems to have one little quirk. This time it was user error, which is just me not muting my laptop where I've got the comments pulled up, or the Facebook comments. So pardon me for that that problem there. So as I was saying, we are here with Reverend Bill Johnson from the Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where Bill serves as the Director of Educational Technology. And Bill has been on our blog for, I don't know, going on 3 years now or so, and he's written a number of posts. He always tends to push my comfort zone a little bit with the topics that we have, and today is no exception. So when Bill said he wanted to talk about a video game, I've known him long enough now to trust him that it's going to turn out well. And sure enough, the blog post that Bill wrote is just fantastic. So the title of the blog post, let me get this right, is "Do we become less human as we interact with androids?" And that's really the theme for today. Also, the theme of this video game that you're going to discuss. And I don't know, I'm curious to get your opinion on what their intentions, the creators of the game's intentions were. But I think that's really one of the key lessons that we'll learn today. So we'll dig into that in just a few minutes. But I wanted to thank you for joining us today, Bill. Thank you to our audience for joining us. If you've got questions for Bill as we're going through, just put them into the chat, and we'll answer them live. If you are watching this after the fact, go ahead and put your questions in there too. We'll be monitoring this after the fact as well. So, Bill, let's talk about androids. And I don't mean the androids like I have on my phone, but what are androids? Just give us that overall summary first.
Sure. Well, in the traditional definition, an android is a robot that is built to look like a human. And of course, there's a variety in there. There's everything from simply that it's shaped like a human. It has 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, that kind of thing, all the way over to completely realistic, where it actually looks like a human. And somebody who didn't necessarily know that it was an android interacting with it wouldn't know the difference, would simply assume that they were dealing with a human being. And we've seen, over the years, it's the stuff of science fiction, but it's kind of in that category of science fiction for now, science fact soon and very soon. We're already seeing companies doing prototypes, that kind of thing, that are still in that uncanny valley, and we can talk about that a little bit if you want to. But nonetheless, as we get down the road a little bit, this is definitely something that's at least going to attempt to be introduced into the market, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Now, androids have been around in pop culture for decades. Do you have any examples that people might be familiar with from movies or TV shows, just to kind of help tie that back to how this isn't, at least in science fiction, this is not a new concept that's going on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can go all the way back to Star Wars, for example. You could argue C-3PO because he's a humanoid figure who's a robot. He's an android. It's kind of a loose definition. In the 80s, where you had Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator, who was clearly an android, looked just like a human, and obviously didn't act the part, but nonetheless visually looked the same. During Star Trek The Next Generation, you had Data, you have the synthetic humans, the Alien series. I mean, there's so many, they're just kind of everywhere. And I think perhaps there is even something spiritual here. And we didn't write on it, and maybe there's a topic for later. There's something inherent in human nature to want to create in our own image. And it's interesting that sometimes that may not even be the most efficient design for the robot, but at the same time, there's still that tendency to want to make something like us.
That's yeah, that may be another topic for another time, because I think you could really get into that. And as I look at some of the robots that are coming out, it is always fascinating when you see those that are meant to be more humanoid, or I mean, I think it's I forget what company out of Boston has been putting the YouTube videos of the dogs that are walking around and opening doors and stuff. They are mostly like some other form of creation. And I think part of it is to make people feel familiar with it. But you bring up a good point. It's not always the most practical. And we see that in our lives with the sinful nature and what has happened to us, that our bodies are not always the most practical. So yeah, another topic for another time. Let's dig into this video game.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right, so I am not a gamer by any means. I found a long time ago that if I start playing a video game, I do not stop playing it. So I kind of avoid it, which is why this topic made me a little hesitant, because it's not one that I'm real familiar with. But tell us about this video game called Detroit Become Human. Give us just a broad overview of what that is. I'm sure you'll have some spoilers, so fair warning, this is a spoiler alert. But yeah, tell us about Detroit.
Sure. Detroit is a recently released game from Quantic Dream. It's PS4 exclusive, so you got to be playing on Sony's platform. And basically, it's a storytelling game. That's what Quantic Dream does. They tell a good story. And the gameplay within it, really, quite honestly, if you're a real hardcore gamer, you're not going to find much to challenge you here. This is about hit the right button at the right time. The story is the star of things. And the story in this case is about Detroit 20 years from now, where androids have become commonplace throughout life. They work as housekeepers, they run errands, cars drive themselves, so you don't need them to do that. But it's this very interesting world that I believe his name is David Cage. I'm certain on the last name, not on the first. Has created and written, where androids behave, as a part of society, but they do so without emotion, because of course we don't program emotion into them. And the plot of the game as it goes forward follows through 3 different androids as they become more and more self-aware, begin to question their own existence as androids, and their own then emotional reactions as they start to break beyond their core program. It's a very interesting idea. It's one we've seen before. This isn't new ground. I mean, Isaac Asimov was doing it back in iRobot, decades ago. But at the same time, it is a new telling of this, and it's set in a new way that culturally is going to be very challenging for us, and something we want to go ahead as a church and get out culturally ahead of before the conversation really hits the mainstream.
All right, very good. Now, we've got a few lessons that you've wrote about, or you've got a few lessons that we'll talk about, but what do you think was the purpose in this storytelling, since it's not as much about the gameplay as it is about what the game is trying to tell the player? What do you think some of those primary stories or lessons are?
I think the primary focus beyond it is really starting to explore and to dig at the idea of what makes something or someone human. And the writer comes down in a very functional viewpoint of that. You are human because you think a certain way, look a certain way, feel a certain way, that kind of thing. And it's very interesting discussion to start having, and it's one we're already starting to have in our culture. I mean, on some level, and this is going way beyond the scope of what we want to dig into today, but that's what's at the heart of the pro-life debate. Sure. Is really because this thing can't talk or think in the ways that we describe, therefore it must not be human, rather than being a human being created in the image of God, simply because of some core identity. We're seeing it in some of Peter Singer's attempts to see old world monkeys recognized as human beings with a sense of personhood and having legal rights. There's a lot of these sorts of things that are already getting at this same core issue. And so the designer of the game is wanting to explore that ground, and very, very clearly comes down on the side of this functional view of humanity, that these androids, because they think, because they feel, because they interact in human ways, are therefore human.
All right, good. Well, let's jump back to what you mentioned a moment ago, that the church really needs to have this conversation, kind of get ahead of this topic now. Certainly, I think that example of pro-life in that debate really points to that. I mean, we as Christians know that we are created in God's image, and so we know that that is a baby, but that is not the norm outside of Christian circles. So going back to the video game, why is this a conversation that the church should have? Why should we care about a video game or this topic of androids?
Sure. Well, part of it is, quite honestly, because video games, at least by some measures, and there's some debate, are at least bigger, or are getting to be the same size as Hollywood. I'll phrase it conservatively. Even the most conservative articles I've read have them at about half the size of the Hollywood movie industry.
Wow.
And so this is a massive part of our culture, whether we're personally plugged into it or not. These stories are being played, they are being told, and on some level are having more impact philosophically than just going to the movie and watching someone else do things, because you are sitting down and you are controlling in many ways the way the story goes. And so this is a huge piece that's going to start determining the discussions we have as a culture. And I don't know that we're 20 years away from having androids around. We're already, like I said, we're seeing prototypes in Japan. Some hotels have installed androids, and right now it's a publicity stunt.
Sure.
You want to just come see the new shiny thing. But 10, 15 years from now, I don't know that that's the case. I start to see these things becoming more and more commonplace. And we could definitely go down a rabbit hole there. I spent all last week at a technology conference looking at the new things that are coming, and it's kind of mind-blowing, some of the new stuff that's not only on the horizon, but already in production. So, both of those things are real key for why this is going to be in the cultural limelight.
And I don't want you to go down that rabbit hole, but give us a little bit about that. What are we already seeing today, and what are we going to see in the next year or two or three that is utilizing this kind of Android or AI type of technology that's going to become commonplace in our lives before we know it, or maybe already has become commonplace and we don't recognize it as such?
Oh, absolutely. AI, if we're dealing just on the artificial intelligence side, the conference wasn't specifically focused on robotics or androids. It was more on marketing and audiovisual technology. But AI is absolutely everywhere. Machine learning, all of that. I mean, and we have it in our phones. We have it in our homes. Your Google Home, your Amazon Alexa, Microsoft's Cortana. These are all examples of AI already existing, already in your home. And they're not necessarily brilliant right now. They haven't figured out, how to go ahead and take care of your whole day's planning for you or that kind of thing. They're not anticipatory, but they are responsive to natural language, and they're already starting to use this to really target what they're doing. And I think one of the things I was most struck by, and it wasn't even a great example, it was a just small manufacturer's booth where what they had set up was a TV screen with a camera embedded on top. And what they were doing is they were running footage of people walking past it. It was doing facial recognition, doing demographic recognition. So, what race are you, what age, male, female, all of that. And then immediately parsing emotional reaction to the display. And so they tell you whether this person in the frame was happy or sad or disgusted or any of these things. And the intent being for advertisers to then be able to use this to target their ads or to adjust their ads in real time based on the audience reaction around them.
Wow.
As we combine that along with the improvements we've seen in robotics lately, General Dynamics, I believe it was, just recently demonstrated an Android humanoid robot, no artificial intelligence behind it, but running, walking, climbing, moving through a completely natural environment on its own. So those sorts of programming tasks that have been very, very hard to accomplish up till now are becoming doable.
Wow. That's crazy. Like you said, science fiction to science fact is the transition that we're on right now. Well, let's talk through some of the questions that you had or that you brought up. And one of them is this section we're titling Strike the Balance. You presented two different arguments here, and that it's important for Christians to strike the balance between these. Can you explain what these two different viewpoints are? And then maybe figure out how are we to strike that balance?
Well, that last part's, of course, the hard part of everything.
That's why I get to ask the question, not answer it.
Hey, wait a minute. Now, on one level, is what the game is trying to put forward is this, like I said, a functional view of humanity. That because something thinks, feels, behaves like a human, looks like a human, it is therefore human. And of course, as Christians, as anybody reading the Word of God, we have to reject that. Humanity is created in the image of God. It's created unique. We unpacked a lot of that back in April. I don't want to rehearse too much of it here, but we are definitely more than just the sum of our functions. There is something unique to humanity that is not only worth being the pinnacle of creation, that thing that moved us from good to very good, but was worth God sending His Son to die, to rise, and conquer death, sin, and the power of the devil for us. So there is definitely something unique, powerful, and valuable about being human. And so when we look at these conversations about machines that just because they look like us or might act like us or might even fool us into thinking they are human, that doesn't therefore make them human and give them the same value. We want to be clear on that and be careful with that. On the other side, and spoiler warning for the game, but I want to draw this in because it's a great example. One of the more tragic stories in the game involves a man who had become a drug addict and who has bought himself an android to replace his wife, and then a second one, actually a younger quote-unquote android, to replace his daughter. And so he's created this perfect toxic situation where he can go home at the end of a day's work, use his drugs, get mad, get abusive, beat up the androids, and if he breaks them, then it's just a matter of taking them to the repair shop. And so that sort of really terribly toxic view where these things, even though they look human, are completely just property with no moral value, is also dangerous. Because we know just from our talks about stewardship that the way we treat the things we have affects us as well. And so, when he abuses his, not really daughter, there is something lost to him in terms of humanity, in terms of the way he is behaving, and in terms of then his relationship with God as well. The way we treat the things that we're given, the gifts that God has given us in this life matters. And so finding that balance between they're completely not human and on the other side that they completely don't matter really is a challenge and a conversation we need to start having, and it's on some level not a new one. We talked about it briefly in the blog where owning a knife, for example, carries with it a certain moral responsibility. It's not completely neutral. It's not human, obviously, but at the same time there is an appropriate and an inappropriate way to use everything we've been given. And so we want to be very careful as we start to step into this world that we're thinking through not just the effects of owning these things, but how we interact with them and what those interactions say about us and how those interactions change us.
So to go back to the question that we posed in the title, do you think that androids and interacting with androids and this thing that's almost, as you said, we make it in our own creation or our own image, it's a bad copy of something that is already sinful. Do we become less human as we interact with androids? And if so, how do we avoid that?
Well, I'm going to come down firmly in the middle of that and say not necessarily. There's certainly an appropriate use where we can see androids as a part of our culture. I question whether they'll ever be the most efficient design for things. I think you're more likely to see your Google Home and your Amazon Alexas become more and more human but remain disembodied voices. We'll see on that. At the same time, regardless, anytime we're interacting with things, there is a way that we can do it that becomes inhuman. And so we want to be careful of that we don't start modeling behaviors that are going to lead to, ways of thinking or even ways of behaving that become very toxic to ourselves and to the world around us.
When I first read this, a silly example popped into my mind. But the more I thought about it and the more I look at these implications, the less silly it became. My wife and I have had a disagreement on whether we should thank Alexa after Alexa does something. And we don't use Alexa for much. More than anything, Alexa is the timer that tells me I need to go and change the laundry and keep it moving. But she always thanks Alexa, and I never did. And I thought, well, it's silly. That thank you doesn't trigger anything. Alexa may hear it, but she doesn't acknowledge it. Why do I do that? Well, then it became more apparent as my kids are listening to me, and as I think about how I interact with other people, if it's all this just ask, and there's no understanding of it, it could change me. So that brought up, your post made me think about that as maybe this is something I should take more seriously than I had previously. What is the main takeaway for us as Christians and for the church on this? You brought up a lot of good points. If you could just summarize that as, if people are going from here and taking away something, what should that be?
Well, I think the one thing the church wants to go ahead and do now is to get out ahead of this conversation. So often culturally, we kind of find ourselves surprised and we end up on our back foot trying to react to the forces of culture. If we can see some of these things coming, then we can get out ahead of them and really begin to teach our people and to teach culture in general, which is what we've always done, what it is to be human, what gives that meaning, and at the very least to begin to determine the ground that conversation will take place on. I don't know that we're going to have the same megaphone that Hollywood or the video game industry does, but at the same time, if we really begin now teaching on this doctrine of humanity, on what does it mean to be created in the image of God, what does it mean to be that for which Christ died, what does it mean to be fully human, then as these questions start to come up, of course, we'll not only answer that first concern of, are these androids human, but at the same time, we'll have a grip on what is it to own things rather than allowing our things to own us. And so if there's one takeaway for somebody listening that wants to go back into their church and start to get out ahead of this cultural conversation, it's exactly that. Let's start talking now, let's start teaching now, so that when these things hit the mainstream market, when suddenly they're everywhere, we're ready to have that conversation.
That's excellent. Well, Bill, as always, thank you for being on here and presenting some really thought-provoking conversation. I really appreciate that you kind of push my limits on ideas. And I ask our audience, if you've got comments for Bill or questions, go ahead and put that in the here on Facebook, and we'll get back to you. But Bill, thanks again for being here, and thank you to our audience for watching. Next week, we're going to go with a topic that's a little less sci-fi, but could be just as challenging, and it's communication in a larger church setting, especially if there's multi-sites. And while that doesn't have as much cultural implications to it, it definitely has implications for the church and how we interact with each other. So please join us next week. We'll be talking with Andrew Osborne, who's got quite a bit of experience in this and is happy to share that with us. So that'll be next Thursday at 11:30 Central Time. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.